I made traditional Chinese dumplings for my white-in-law's family reunion. What happened next destroyed my marriage. I am 28, female and Chinese American. My husband, James, and my in-laws are all white. Looking back now, I should have seen the signs earlier, but love has a way of making you overlook the red flags, especially when they're wrapped in polite smiles and casual dismissals. I met James 3 years ago at a tech startup in San Francisco where we both worked as software developers. He was different from the other guys I'd dated, quiet, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in my culture, or so I thought at the time. When he asked me about my family's traditions or the meaning behind certain customs, his eyes would light up with curiosity. He even attempted to learn Mandarin, though he never got much further than ni hao and shexi. My mother, Linda, was less than thrilled when I told her about James. She sat at our family's kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling jasmine tea, and said, "May, there are so many good Chinese men. Why do you want to complicate your life?" I remember how the steam from her cup fogged up her glasses, but I could still see the worry in her eyes. My father remained silent, as he often did during these conversations, but I could tell he shared her concerns. My sister, Grace, was more direct. "You're just asking for trouble," she said during one of our weekly dim sum meetings. "These mixed marriages, they always end up with someone compromising their identity." I dismissed her concerns, convinced that love would be enough to bridge any cultural gaps. James proposed after a year of dating. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet moment in his apartment after we'd ordered takeout from my favorite Sichuan restaurant. The ring was beautiful, a classic solitaire that caught the light just right, but what I remember most was his nervousness when he asked if I'd be willing to meet his parents before we announced our engagement. That first meeting with his parents was tense. His mother, Barbara, lived in a sprawling colonial-style house in the suburbs of Boston, all white walls and antique furniture that looked too precious to touch. His father, Robert, was cordial but distant, the kind of man who seemed more comfortable discussing the stock market than making personal connections. They served pot roast and mashed potatoes, and Barbara made a point of mentioning how she'd toned down the seasoning because she wasn't sure what I could handle. I should have paid more attention to how James acted around them, how his spine straightened, how his voice changed slightly, becoming more clipped and formal. How he didn't correct his mother when she repeatedly referred to me as Oriental. But I was too focused on trying to make a good impression, on being the perfect potential daughter-in-law. When we told my family about the engagement, my mother cried, and not tears of joy. She refused to help plan any wedding celebrations, saying she couldn't support a union that would erase her daughter's heritage. Grace was more pragmatic but equally disapproving. "At least get a prenup," she advised, "so when it falls apart, you'll have something to fall back on." In the end, we had a small civil ceremony at City Hall. Just us, a couple of friends from work, and James's younger sister Emily, who seemed to be the only member of his family who was genuinely happy for us. No red dress for good luck, no tea ceremony, none of the traditions I'd grown up expecting would be part of my wedding day. James promised we'd have a proper celebration later, when both families had come around. The first 2 years of marriage were not exactly what I'd imagined, but not terrible either. We lived in our own bubble in San Francisco, far enough from both families to avoid most of the tension. James would occasionally mention his parents, usually after his mother called to guilt him about not visiting more often, but we developed an unspoken agreement to keep our families separate. I tried to maintain my cultural connections in small ways. I cooked Chinese food when I was feeling homesick, teach James about different festivals and traditions, even started a small vegetable garden on our balcony with Chinese vegetables I couldn't easily find in local stores. James would eat what I cooked, listen to my stories, but there was always something slightly detached about his interest, like someone admiring an exotic exhibit at a museum. Then came the invitation to the family reunion. James's grandmother was turning 80, and Barbara was organizing a big gathering at their house. "Everyone will be there," James said, his eyes bright with excitement. "All my cousins, aunts, uncles, even the ones from Minnesota are flying in. You have to come, May. They need to get to know you properly." I spent weeks preparing for this gathering. I wanted to make a good impression, to show them that I could be part of their family while still honoring my own heritage. I decided to make xiaolongbao, something that always impressed people when they tried it for the first time. The night before the reunion, I stayed up late preparing the filling, carefully pleating each dumpling, making sure they were perfect. The reunion itself started awkwardly from the moment we arrived. James's extended family filled the house and spilled out onto the back patio, all of them speaking with the same Boston accent, all of them looking at me with varying degrees of curiosity and discomfort. His Aunt Susan kept asking me where I really came from, even after I explained I was born in California. His cousin Mike made a joke about mail-order brides that he thought I couldn't hear. Emily, bless her heart, tried to run interference, but she was just one person against a tide of microaggressions. I held onto my plate of xiaolongbao like a shield, waiting for the right moment to present it. The dining room table was loaded with what Barbara apparently considered appropriate family reunion food: casseroles, potato salad, something involving jello and marshmallows that I couldn't quite identify. Still, I thought, food brings people together. Maybe this could be a bridge. When I finally placed my plate on the table, Barbara's reaction was swift and brutal. The look she gave me, like I'd placed something dirty among her precious family dishes, made my stomach clench. She came over, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a judge's gavel, and asked in that false sweet voice that mothers-in-law seem to perfect, "What have you got there?" I explained what xiaolongbao were, tried to describe how they were eaten, even started to mention how they were considered a delicacy in Shanghai, but she cut me off mid-sentence. "Eastern food," she said, making it sound like a curse word, "doesn't belong in my home." Then she picked up my plate, the dumplings I'd spent hours making, and walked straight to the trash can. The room went quiet. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, could sense them waiting to see how I would react. James stood near his mother, his face a mask of discomfort, but he said nothing. Not a word in my defense. Emily started to say something, but Barbara silenced her with a look. I walked out, my cheeks burning with humiliation. The car was parked on the street, and I sat there for what felt like forever, watching the shadows lengthen across the manicured suburban lawns. I thought about calling my mother, but I couldn't bear to hear the "I told you so" in her voice. I thought about calling Grace, but she would probably start researching divorce lawyers before I finished telling her what happened. James came out after an hour, carrying a plate of food from the reunion. He got into the driver's seat without a word and started the car. The silence between us felt like a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. Finally, halfway home, he cleared his throat and said, "Yeah, sorry about that. My mom really doesn't like any culture outside of my family's." That's when it hit me, this wasn't just about the dumplings. This wasn't even just about me. This was about James's complete inability to stand up to his family, to defend not just me but our entire relationship. When we got home, I called Grace anyway. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for my call. "Divorce him," she said immediately, not even letting me finish the story. "Marry someone who understands you, someone from our culture. This is only going to get worse." In the background, I could hear her laptop keys clicking, probably already pulling up those divorce lawyer websites. My mother was more subdued when I called her, but I could hear the pain in her voice. "Meyer," she said, using my Chinese name, something she only did when she was deeply serious, "I never wanted this for you. Not because he is white, but because I knew his family would never truly accept you as their own." James spent the next few days acting like nothing had happened. He went to work, came home, watched TV, all while I was quietly falling apart. When I tried to talk to him about it, he just shrugged and said his family didn't really care about our relationship one way or the other. But I remembered the looks, the whispered comments, the way Barbara had smiled triumphantly after throwing away my dumplings. A week after the reunion, Barbara called. Not me, she'd never called me directly, but James. I could hear her voice through the phone, sharp and insistent. She was planning a 4th of July barbecue, and of course, we had to come. James looked at me while he listened to her, and for a moment, I thought he might decline. Instead, he said we'd be there, then asked if we should bring anything. "Nothing ethnic," I heard her reply clearly, followed by a laugh like she'd made a clever joke. That night, I lay awake thinking about my mother's wedding day. She'd shown me the pictures 1,000 times, her in the traditional red qipao, my father in his black suit, both of them beaming as they served tea to their elders. She'd always told me that respecting our traditions didn't mean we couldn't embrace new ones, but it did mean we shouldn't let anyone make us ashamed of who we are. The next morning, I found James in the kitchen, making coffee like it was just another day. "We need to talk," I said, and for the first time since the reunion, I felt completely clear about what I needed to say. He turned around, coffee pot in hand, and I could see in his eyes that he knew what was coming. Maybe he'd known all along that this moment was inevitable. "Your mother didn't just reject my food," I told him. "She rejected my culture, my heritage, everything that makes me who I am. And you? You just stood there. You've always just stood there." He started to respond with his usual "that's just how they are" excuse, but I cut him off. "No, James. That's not good enough anymore." I took off my wedding ring, the one that had seemed so perfect that night he proposed, and placed it on the counter. I can't be part of a family that sees me as something to be tolerated at best, erased at worst. And I can't be with someone who won't stand up for me, for us. He didn't try to stop me when I went to pack my things. He didn't argue when I said I'd be staying with Grace until I found my own place. He just stood in the kitchen, coffee growing cold in his cup, looking lost in his own home. As I loaded the last box into my car, I remembered something my grandmother used to say: "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you made a mistake." She usually said this when teaching me how to make dumplings. If the pleats weren't right, it was better to start over than try to force something that wasn't working. I drove to Grace's apartment, where she was waiting with open arms and a pot of our mother's congee simmering on the stove. As I sat at her kitchen table, watching the steam rise from my bowl, I felt something unexpected: not sadness, not anger, but relief. Relief that I wouldn't have to shrink myself anymore, wouldn't have to pretend that casual racism didn't hurt, wouldn't have to watch the man I loved choose silence over standing up for what was right. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily: "I'm so sorry. They're wrong, and I told them so." At least one person in that family had found their voice. Maybe someday James would find his too, but it wouldn't be my job to wait around and see if that happened. That evening, my mother came over with ingredients to make xiaolongbao. As we stood in Grace's kitchen, folding and pleating dumplings together like we'd done countless times before, she didn't say "I told you so." Instead, she taught me a new pleating technique, one that made the dumplings even more secure. "Sometimes," she said, her fingers moving quickly and surely, "we need to fall apart a little bit to come back together stronger." The dumplings we made that night weren't perfect. Some were a little lopsided, others had uneven pleats. But when we bit into them, the soup inside was hot and flavorful, and the wrapper held together just fine. Sometimes, I realized, that's enough.